Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring Superhuman Powers, Volume 2. Say Hello for Me by Frank W. Coggins. When I Grow Up by Richard E. Lowe. Gangway for Homer by George A. Hahn. Death of a Mutant by Charles V. DeVette. The Deadly Ones by F. L. Wallace. Say Hello for Me by Frank W. Coggins. Originally published in If Worlds of Science Fiction, May 1953. Narrated by Tom Trussel. This was to be the day, but of course Professor Pettibone had no way of knowing it. He arose, as he had been doing for the previous 20 years, donned the tattered remnants of his spacesuit, and went out into the open. He stood erect, bronzed, magnificent, faced distant Earth, and recited, "Good morning, bright sunshine. We're glad you are here. You make the world happy and bring us good cheer." It was something he had heard as a child, and, isolated here on Mars, he had remembered it and used it to keep from losing his power of speech. The ritual finished, he walked to the edge of the nearest canal and gathered a bushel or so of dried Martian moss. He returned and began polishing the shiny exterior of the wrecked spaceship. It had to really glitter if it was to be an effective beacon in guiding the rescue ship. Professor Pettibone had known for years, that a ship would come. It was just a matter of time, and as the years slipped by, his faith diminished not a whit. With his task half completed, he glanced up at the sun and quickened the polishing. It was a long walk to the place the berry bushes grew, and if he arrived too late, the sun would have dried out the night's crop of fragile berries, and he would wait until the morrow for nourishment. But on this day, he was fated to arrive at the bush area not at all, because an alien sound from above again drew the professor's eyes from his work, and he knew that the day had arrived. The ship was 3 times as large as any he had ever visualized, and its futuristic design told him sharply how far he had fallen behind in his dreaming. He smiled and said, quite calmly, "I dare say I'm about to be rescued." And he experienced a thrill as the great ship set down and 2 men emerged therefrom. A thrill tinged with a guilt sense, because emotional experiences were rare in an isolated life and seemed somehow indecent. The 2 men held weapons. They advanced upon Professor Pettibone, looked up into his face, reflected a certain wary hostility. That the hostility was tinged with instinctive respect, even awe, made it no less potent. One of them asked, "Fella, man came in ship, skyboat, long time ago. Him dead? Where?" Appropriate gestures accompanied the words. Professor Pettibone smiled down at the little men and bowed. "You are, of course, referring to me. I came in the ship. I am Professor Pettibone. It was nice of you to hunt me up." The eyes of the 2 Terran spacemen met and locked in startled inquiry. One of them voiced the reaction of both when he said, "What the hell?" "You no doubt are curious as to the fate of the other members of the expedition. They were killed, all save Fletcher, who lasted a week." Professor Pettibone waved a hand. "There, in the graveyard." But their eyes remained on the only survivor of that ill-fated first expedition. It was hard to accept him as the man they sought, but, faced with the undeniable similarity between what they expected and what they had found, The two spacemen had no alternative. "I hope your food supply is ample and varied," Professor Pettibone said. This seemed to bring them out of their bemusement. "Of course, Professor. Would you care to come aboard?" The other made a try at congenial levity. "You must be pretty hungry after 20 years. "Really, has it been that long? I tried to keep track at first." "We can blast off any time you say. You're probably pretty anxious to get back." "Indeed, I am. The changes in 20 years must be breathtaking. I wonder if they'll remember me." A short time later, the professor said, "It's amazing, a ship of this size handled by only 2 men. Then he sat down to a repast laid out by one of the awed spacemen. But after nibbling a bit of this, a forkful of that, he found that satisfaction lay in the anticipation more so than in the eating. "We'll look around and see what we can find in the way of clothing for you, Professor," one of the spacemen said. Then the man's bemusement returned. His eyes travelled over the magnificent physique before him. The perfect giant of a man, the great Apollo-like head with the calm, clear eyes, the expression of complete contentment and serenity. The spaceman said, "Professor, to what do you attribute the changes in your body? What is there about this planet?" "I really don't know." Professor Pettibone looked down his torso with an impersonal eye. "I think the greenish skin pigmentation is a result of mineral-heavy vapors that occur during certain seasons. The growth. As to my body, I really don't know." But the two spacemen, though they didn't refer to it, were not concerned with the body so much as the aura of completeness, the radiation of contentment which came from somewhere within. And it was passing strange that nothing more was said about the professor returning to Earth. No great revelation suddenly arrived at that he would not go. Rather, they discussed various things that 3 gentlemen, meeting casually, would discuss. Then Professor Pettibone arose from his chair and said, "It was kind of you to drop off and see me." And one of the spacemen replied, "A pleasure, sir, a real pleasure indeed." Then the professor left the ship and watched it lift up on a tail of red fire and go away. He raised an arm and waved. "Say hello for me," he called. Then he turned away, and from force of habit he began again to polish the hull, knowing that he would keep it shining and be proud of it for many years to come. Almost beyond reach of the planet, one of the spacemen flipped a switch and put certain sensitive communication mechanisms to work. So sensitive they could pick up etheric vibrations far away and make them audible. But only faintly came the pleasant voice of a contented man. "Good morning, bright sunshine. We're glad you are here. You make the world." The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. When I Grow Up by Richard E. Lowe. Originally published in Fantastic Universe, September 1956. Narrated by Tom Trussel. The university sprawled casually, unashamed of its disordered ranks, over 100,000 acres of grassy rolling countryside. It was the year A.D. 3896, and the vast assemblage of schools and colleges and laboratories had been growing on this site for more than 2,000 years. It had survived political and industrial revolutions, local insurrections, global, interterrestrial, and nuclear wars, and it had become the acknowledged center of learning for the entire known universe. No subject was too small to escape attention at the university. None was too large to be attacked by the fearless, probing fingers of curiosity. or to in any way overawe students and teachers in this great institution of learning. No book was ever closed in the university, and no clue, however tiny, was discarded as useless in the ceaseless search for knowledge which was the university's prime and overriding goal. For no matter how fast and far the spaceships might fly, or what strange creatures might be brought back across the great curve of the universe, or how deeply the past was resurrected, or the future probed, of one thing only was the university quite sure. Man did not know enough. All manner of schools had come into being at the university, and often they functioned in pairs, one devoted to proving a proposition, and the other to disproving it. And among these pairs of schools, two, in particular, seemed to exist on a most tenuous basis. Their avowed mission was to settle the age-old argument concerning the relative influences of heredity and environment. One, headed by Professor Miltschek von Possenfeller, worked tirelessly to prove that there was no such determining factor as heredity, and that environment alone was the governing influence in human behavior. The other, under the direction of Dr. Arthur D. Smithlawn, was dedicated to the task of proving that environment meant nothing and that only heredity was important. Success, in short, could only come to those who were born with the genes of success in their bodies, and failure was as preordained for the rest as was ultimate death for all. Over a period of more than 200 years, the School of Environment had been taking babies from among the thousands of homeless waifs gathered in throughout the universe, and raising them carefully in a closely supervised cultural atmosphere. The School of Heredity, on the other hand, was more select. Its pupils came only from families whose genealogy could be traced back for at least 1,000 years. Freedom of choice and expression was the rule here, since the school was attempting to prove that a child's inherited tendencies will send it inevitably along a predetermined path, completely uninfluenced by outside help or hindrance. In 2 centuries, neither school had been able to develop an overpowering case in support of its own theory. Hence, they both thrived and cheerfully ignored the discrepancies which existed in the case records of individuals who had not turned out according to the book. Although they were zealous professional rivals, Professor von Possenfeller and Dr. Smithlawn were devoted personal friends. They called each other Posse and Smithy, and got together once a week to play chess and exchange views on the universe in general. Only one subject was taboo between them: their experimental work. On this particular Saturday night, however, Smithy noticed that his good friend Posse was terribly agitated and disturbed, and had for the 3rd time carelessly put his queen in jeopardy. "My dear friend," exclaimed Posse, blindly moving his king into check, "could you possibly be persuaded to ignore for the moment our ban on professional talk? There is something—" Smithy, secretly, was only too anxious to talk at great length, but he pretended to give the request serious consideration. "If it is really important," he said, "yes, by all means, go right ahead." "Smithy," Posse plunged on, "I am nonplussed. I am really terribly disturbed. I've never felt like this before." Smithy waited patiently while Posse poured himself a large brandy and soda, hastily gulped it down, and made a face as he regretted the action. "How much do you know about our methods of working in the School of Environment?" the professor asked, taking a new tack. "Nothing, of course," replied Smithy. The statement was not precisely true, but Smithy was not yet ready to confess that he had spies in his friend's school. "Well, then," said Posse, knowing full well that Smithy had been getting reports on his college for many years, and feeling secretly glad that he, in turn, had been spying. "Well, then," he repeated, You should be aware that we know absolutely nothing about the children we enroll. Most of them are infants. We do not know who their parents were, or where they were born. Except for the obvious clues which their bodies furnished, we do not even know their national or racial origins. We bring them up with absolutely equal treatment, the finest of everything. At the age of 5, we divide them arbitrarily into classes and begin training them for occupations. Some we educate as scholars, some labourers, some professional men. In me, dear friend, you see one of the triumphs of our methods. I myself was a foundling, raised and educated in the school of environment. Whatever I may be, I owe to the school. He paused to give Smithy a chance to digest the statement. Of course, Possip continued, we take into consideration such factors as physical build and muscular development. We don't train undersized boys to be freight handlers. But in general, the division is arbitrary, and you'd be amazed how they respond to it. To keep a check on things, we interview our students twice a year to see how much they have learned. We always ask them what they want to be when they grow up. That enables us to determine whether or not the training is really taking hold. Occasionally, it is true, we find a case where the schooling seems to run counter to natural aptitudes. Smithy could not resist interrupting. Natural aptitudes? I am surprised to hear you use such an expression. I thought you furnished your students with aptitudes through environmental conditioning. Stiffly, Posse retorted, Some time we will have a full objective discussion of the matter. It is not pertinent at this moment. Of course I believe in natural or instinctive aptitudes, but I do not believe that they are inherited from parents or even from remote ancestors. Cosmic rays, perhaps, needled Smithy, and became instantly sorry when his friend's face began to redden. Posse didn't believe in cosmic rays, obviously. Smithy apologized. Posse sighed deeply and made a fresh start. My friend, he said, in your work, as I understand it, you learn everything you can about a student's past and about his progenitors. By so doing, you hope to be able to predict his future abilities, his likes and his dislikes. But what course do you pursue when you find a boy who just doesn't prove out according to the prognostications? Smithy mumbled a few evasive words in reply, but refused to be drawn into giving a positive answer. Never mind, Posse said. What would you say if you asked a boy what he liked, or what he wanted to do, and his answer concerned something that never existed, or had never been dreamed of? Something horrible. Smithy's eyebrows perked up. He made no attempt to conceal the fact that his interest had been aroused. What precisely do you mean? He demanded. Just this, Posse said, leaning forward to give emphasis to his words. We have a boy who is being trained as a space navigator. He is very bright, he is of medium build, as a spaceman must be, and he learns easily and willingly. We are sure now that he will be ready for pre-space school 2 years before he reaches the minimum age. Yet, whenever this boy is asked what he wants to do, he replies, I want to be a destructor. Smithy's lips parted, but for a moment he remained completely silent while his mind stumbled over the strange term. Destructor? He repeated at last. Wait, said Posse, and listen carefully. This boy is now 10 years old. He first gave me that answer 3 days ago. He repeated it 2 days ago, then yesterday, and again today. I had never interviewed him before. I never interview a student personally until the 10th year, so I quite naturally had his files double-checked. Smithy, he's been giving the same answer ever since he was 5 years old. 2 interviews a year for 6 years, and 3 extra ones this week. Imagine! 15 times this boy has said he wants to be a destructor, and no one even knows what a destructor is. Well, Smithy said with a shrug, convinced that Posse was getting all excited over nothing, I admit it seems strange, and highly single-minded for so young a boy, but don't you imagine it's some word he just made up?
I admitted that as a possibility until this morning. But look here."
Posse reached behind his chair and took up a small leather bag. Slowly he unzipped it and delved inside. Then, with a grim flourish, he brought forth the body of a cat. As Smithy's eyes widened, Posse said dramatically,
"Smithy, that boy killed this cat with a glance."
"With a what?"
"A glance. You heard me correctly. He just looked at the cat, and the beast dropped dead. And he did it to other things too. A sparrow, a baby fox. Why, he even did it to a rat that had been cornered by this very cat. I tell you, I had never been so shaken by anything in all my life. I said to myself, 'Posse, have you got yourself a mutant?' 'No,' I replied. 'He's completely normal in every respect, physically and otherwise. He's a bit brighter than average, perhaps, 98.6 in his studies, including elementary astrophysics. He speaks brilliantly, composes poetry, even invents little gadgets. He's a genius, maybe, but not a mutant.' Then I asked myself, 'How do you account for the cat?'" Posse paused, inferentially transferring the question to his friend. "I can't account for the cat," Smithy said, "unless we assume its death was a coincidence. But I confess you've aroused my curiosity. Could I see and talk to this boy who wants to be he grimaced, a distractor?" "I'm glad you asked," Posse sighed with relief. "Actually, he is outside now, waiting to join us. But I must warn you that you'll find him quite precocious. However, he's extremely amenable." Posse went quickly to the door, opened it, and called, "Herbucks, come in." The boy entered. He was, Smithy observed, a quite ordinary-looking boy. He was so obviously 10 years old that you couldn't say he was either old or young, large or small, fat or thin, or anything else, for his age. He was just 10 years old and a boy. "Herbucks," said Posse, "I wanted to meet a friend of mine, the famous Dr. Smith Lorne."
"How do you do, sir?" Herbucks said politely. "How do you do?" returned Smithy. He had already decided not to be patronizing, but to take a bold, frank, comradely course with the lad. "Herbucks," he said, "Professor von Possenfeller has been telling me the story of your life. Now you tell me, Herbucks, not what you want to be when you grow up, but why." "I don't know why, sir," Herbucks replied easily. "I only know that I want to be a distractor." "But, Herbucks, what is a distractor?" Herbucks looked around the room. He saw Smithy's birdcage, walked over to it, and stared for a moment quietly at Dickie, the doctor's parakeet. Dickie looked back, chirped angrily twice, and toppled from his perch. He landed on his back, his tiny feet rigid and unmoving. He was quite dead, Smithy observed, with a sudden, detached, unbelieving horror. Why, Dickie was 7 years old, and he had been as good a pet as any lonely old professor could have desired as a cheery avian companion. "Look here, young man," he began sternly. Then, as the shock passed, he hastily changed his tone. "Suppose this child did have some strange sort of power. Mystic, perhaps, but definitely abnormal. He may belong in the school of the future, Smithy thought. Or perhaps in the school of the past, the Dark Ages department, but not here." "Don't worry, sir," Herbucks said. "I can't do it to you." "But do what?" Smithy cried. "What did you do?" "I distracted." Smithy took a deep breath. He felt as though a cruel hoax had been played on him. After all, Posse could have lied about the cat and the other creatures, and the boy was quite obviously bright enough to learn lines and play a part. But how explain Dickie? He tried to calculate the coincidental odds that might have caused Dickie to die a natural death at one precise instant in time under unusual and exact circumstances. They proved to be incalculable to his unmathematical brain.
He rubbed his face with the palms of both hands. Then he turned abruptly to Posse. "I just don't know what to say about it," he explained. "How could I know? How could anybody know?" He faced the boy again. "Look here, Herbux, this power of yours, when did you first notice you had it?" "Last year, sir. I always knew I could do it some time. But one day I was looking at a bird perched on my windowsill, and it fell over dead, just as your parakeet did. I thought it was an accident or a coincidence, but then the next day it happened again, with a squirrel. Soon I got to where I could do it on purpose, but I don't know how." "Well, how do you feel about it? Do you want to kill these harmless pets?"
"Oh, no, sir. I don't want to kill them. I just want to be a destructor."
Smithy had a sudden disquieting conviction that he was in the presence of some completely alien, dangerous being. A cold breeze seemed to shiver through the room, though he knew that his quarters were airtight and perfectly ventilated. "This is ridiculous," he told himself, turning to Posse with a helpless shrug. "To feel like this over such a nice-looking young lad." "My friend," he said, "all this has occurred so suddenly I must have time to think. Such a thing could never have happened in my school. Perhaps you should, but doubtless it has already occurred to you, turn him over to physio-psychological rebuilding." Posse nodded. "It has, of course. But then I said to myself, Posse, they are a bunch of dunder-headed old fossils over there. They can take a criminal and tear him apart and make a good citizen out of him, granted. But do they find out why he was a criminal? Have they reduced the number of new criminals? No. And they would not find out why this boy wants to be a destructor, nor even what a destructor is." "You're right," I told myself. "And besides, Herbux is a nice boy. Why, with this power of his, if he wanted to do harm, there wouldn't be an animal left alive around the whole university. And if he could do it to people, he's had many an opportunity to practice on me. But has he? No, not once. Besides, if you keep him in school, you can maintain a good close watch over him. Herbux has promised to keep me fully informed as to the progress of his strange power. If he feels it getting stronger, he will let me know immediately. Isn't that right, Herbux?"
"Yes, sir,"
said the boy quietly. "You are quite sure," Smithy asked, "that you know absolutely nothing about this boy's past? His parents, his birthplace, anything at all? There must be some clue." "You know very well I don't," Posse retorted angrily. "I just thought that perhaps you might have subjected him to hypno-research," Smithy said placatingly. "I wouldn't dream of such a thing," Posse began, and stopped with a gasp. "How did you know about that?" he demanded. Smithy was flustered. That is—" He could think of no convincing answer. Hypno-research was one of Posse's most secret projects. He had used it constantly in his efforts to determine reasons for non-conformity to set patterns of behavior in some of his more recalcitrant students. He had kept it a secret because it added up to an admission that perhaps heredity could play a part in the development of a student's character. "Smithy, my dear old friend," he said with mock humility, "this is no time for us to quarrel. Let us face the facts candidly. You have been spying on my school, and I in turn have been spying on yours. I know, for instance, that when your students don't behave the way their heredity charts predict, you often use hypnotherapy to change their thought lines and force them to conform. Is that any less fair than what I do?" Smithy sighed. "I guess not, my friend. No, wait. I will go farther than that. It is not a matter of guessing. I'm quite certain about it. We are a couple of aging frauds, struggling selfishly along, playing with the lives of these children solely to keep our jobs. Perhaps we should—" "Nevertheless, we have a problem," interrupted Posse. "It's a problem that won't be solved by our becoming senile idiots. Get your mind back on Herbux and help me. I feel this is a most desperate situation. If it gets beyond just the two of us, we are likely to be thoroughly investigated. Then goodness knows what would happen." "But why? The child can do no real harm. Suppose he does destruct an animal or two, there are plenty more, and sooner or later they would die of natural causes anyway, and it's unthinkable that he could ever do it to people." Smithy paused, obviously struck by a startling thought. He turned to Herberts. "Boy," he said, quite sternly, "come here." Herberts obeyed, advancing to within a foot of the old doctor and facing him squarely. "Look me in the eyes," Smithy commanded. Questioningly, Herberts began to stare at Smithy. "Well," Smithy said after a time, "turn it on." A set look came over Herberts's face. His lips were compressed, and a thin dew of sweat had broken out on his forehead. Posse stood aghast, slowly comprehending what his old friend Smithy was doing. He was actually risking his life, or so he believed, to prove that the child could not destruct a human being. He wanted to stop the boy, but he could not move from where he stood. Suddenly Herberts broke and turned away. He began to sob. "It's no use," he cried. "I can't do it. I just can't do it." Smithy went to him and put an arm on his shoulders. "Tell me, boy," he exclaimed, "what do you mean? Do you mean that you can't bring yourself to do it, or that it is physically impossible?" Herberts just stood there, his head bowed, crying wildly. "I just can't do it," he repeated, sounding now completely heartbroken. Posse, coming alive again, said soothingly, "Don't cry, son. It's not bad. It's good that you can't do it." Herberts whirled around, facing Posse, his face inflamed with a sudden rage. "But I will!" he screamed. "I will do it! I will! When I grow up!"
The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Gangway for Homer by George R. Hahn. Originally published in Science Fiction Quarterly, Spring, 1942. Narrated by Tom Trussel. His name was really John Smith. Incredibly enough, it had always been John Smith. As far back as people in his circle and neighbourhood could remember, it had been John Smith, and they could remember back all the way to when he had been a mere tottering tot, to the swaddling clothes days. He was what might be called a medium man. His height was medium. His middle age was medium. His hair, eyes, and nose were medium. Unpretentious he looked, and adequate. He fulfilled his name, which, as we mentioned above, was John Smith, not Achilles Maravain. Yet she persisted in calling him Achilles Maravain. She declaimed, she cried out, she excited herself and all present, all to the effect that John Smith was Achilles Maravain. Everybody paid her the best of attention, although they couldn't believe her. Everybody regarded her with interest. She had a wild, pale, exotic-looking face, a figure it would be indelicate to remark upon, and legs that were crystallized ecstasy. They listened to her words. They gazed upon her. The Los Angeles Forum of Camera Arts gazed to satiety on face and figure and legs, and sighed en masse. Insanely gay sighs, sighed they. She was desirable, and moreover she had interrupted President Soupy's discussion of repentance, a camera study in monotone by Pierre de Lambardier. Had you ever listened to President Soupy remarking that such and such was
taken on a Zeiss Super Iconta B with matched pneumatic ultralight film at an exposure of f5.6 with diaphragm, etc. You too would have been gay, insanely gay, to have had him interrupted by a luscious-looking pair of legs like that. Thus, everybody was happy. The LAFCA was happy. The lost-looking scientist with a galvanometer and other trivia was happy. And the three dapper young men were happy. Even John Smith was happy. His happiness was obvious in the reluctance with which he took his departure, in his formality. He rose from his seat and said to the three dapper young men, of the hard, virtuous faces, "The Federal Bureau of Investigation, I presume?" "Right," crisply, youngishly. "John Smith, alias Achilles Maravain, you are under arrest on charges of murder, seditious conduct, and high treason against the government of the United States. Will you come along quietly?" Achilles, for it is as such he is to be referred to forever hence, did not come along quietly. He did not come along. In point of fact, he went his own way. The three grim young men to the FBI bitterly contested his going, and since, as everyone knows nowadays, to touch Achilles Maravain was to undergo collapse, disintegration, and death. The results were unfortunate. This was the first, and perhaps most important, incident in his history. It was the acorn from which sprouted that large and aberrant oak tree that was Achilles Maravain. The next important incident, a scene perhaps even more diverting than the last, was the Lincoln Heights scene. As the odds are against it that the reader of this is either an archaeologist or some pervertedly informed devotee of ancient Los Angeles topography, it is excusable to mention that Lincoln Heights was a jail of the city, an institution comparable in purpose to our modern concentration camps, but differing in that it was merely a squat, few-story cement structure abundantly furnished with steel bars, locks, chains, gyves, paraphernalia, and policemen. Its architecture was thus ideal for Achilles' purposes. His purposes being to imprison the prison, purposes in which he succeeded. His remarkable feat first manifested itself when Sergeant Leary crashed titanically into nothingness. Not actual nothingness, as was evidenced by its palpability, but a substance that, for all practical purposes, was non-existent. All practical purposes, that is, except that of preventing exit or entry in regards to the Lincoln Heights jail. Sergeant Leary withdrew his nose a few paces, vigorously rubbing that injured member, and stared quizzically at this absurd tangibility. He stared for a long and ponderous time, and then began shouting. Minions of the law popped miraculously into view at this point, as if conjured there by the magic of Leary's stentorian voice. Miraculously they popped, and popping, equally miraculously, popped no more. The invisible barrier restrained them. It framed their popping faces, their popping eyes. It kept them within the building, sealing the doors, the windows, the walls. It was, in fact, a prison. Achilles Maravain had imprisoned the prison. Had he stopped there, there's a shade of a ghost's super-attenuated chance that all might have been forgotten, except perhaps by the infuriated gendarmerie and prisoners who were left permanently to their own devices within the Lincoln Heights jail. But Achilles didn't stop. He visited the First Street headquarters jail and imprisoned it. He visited all the jails. Likewise, the insane asylums and the hospitals. Personal appearance tour it was. An interstate tour. He went to Salt Lake City, and there gave a repeat performance. jails, hospitals, etc. Thence to Denver, thence to Topeka, thence to Kansas City, followed by St. Louis, followed by Indianapolis, and all the way to the East Coast. It is not to be supposed that he was uncontested in this progression. Very much to the contrary, he was shot at. Often, and with the utmost accuracy, was he fired upon. Apparently, however, with no effect, for he seemed invulnerable. Not elusive was our Achilles, not wily, not adroit, not even clever. He was merely invulnerable, and clumsily so to boot. He would wade into a mass of stalwart police or soldiers. The militia tried cannons on him, and projectiles would simply bounce away from him. They would explode in the conventional manner, only no fragments or concussion waves apparently could reach him. After this, the opposition would be scattered, like their proverbial chaff. It was a melee, a very horrifying and immensely entertaining mess. Chaos there was, and wildness, and fantasy, and even fanaticism. Yes, even the latter. This last was instanced the time a group of misdirected fans of Achilles misconstrued him, and, in the belief that he was the Almighty, surrounded him in the midst of the pursuit of one of his more stirring enterprises. He misconstrued them too. They still remain, so far as is known, in the housing he provided their zeal. Now we return to the beginning of the story, not for the sake of confusion, but merely to pick up a most important thread. Remember the camera forum scene, and Los Angeles. Los Angeles, if you are following the mood of this story, is mere dust and collapse by now. Nevertheless, we return to the vanished metropolis, and to the forum, the three young men of the FBI, and to the lost-looking scientist with a galvanometer and other trivia. The scientist whom you probably never noticed, having been lost in the spell of her. The lost-looking scientist was happy, too. His happiness lay in that he had come to a conclusion, one affecting Achilles Maravane. His conclusion was that Maravane was scientifically explainable. Not just his feats, not just the decimation he wrought upon police, not just the prisons in which he enveloped prisons. No, more than that, the works. Everything about Achilles Maravane, his personality, his attitude toward life, love, and literature, all down to his very knee-jerks. First and most important of all, our Achilles had an inferiority complex. Definitely. The proposition that anyone who had actually, with reason, been called John Smith all his life did not have an inferiority complex was fantastic. But the man's actions proved it beyond doubt. He picked on criminals, insane, and the sick, because he felt inferior to them, and compensated thus. Amazing logic? Well, everyone thought so at the time, although, as you can see, it was really extraordinarily simple. But at the time, everyone was amazed, even the scientist himself. He gloried in it, glowed, and entering further into the spirit and tempo of his theories, babbled out point after telling point. Argued, philosophized. He quoted statistics about the ratio of invention to the inferiority complex and compared it with the results Achilles had obtained. He proved that ultra-vibrational force walls, this being essentially what Achilles had developed for the demolition of law and order and for the production of honest-to-God, foolproof, tamper-proof prisons, were Machiavellian, Mephistophelian, and just plain hellish. Why invent them, then, except to demonstrate a superiority the inventor really didn't feel? The scientist meditated further, brooded, calculated, grunted a while, and then predicted, or as he put it, prognosticated, that Achilles would declare himself a dictator. which Achilles did. In this, however, there was a flaw. Here lay his weakness. Not in the actual fact that he protested himself the greatest and wisest of men, but that he attempted wiles. He didn't come out with it forthrightly. He wasn't blunt as he had been with his interesting massacres. He proved himself cagey, contemptible, striking the humanitarian pose. He was, he stated, producing all these absorbing newspaper stories for man's own good. Or rather, man's. Man with a capital M. A document he issued, long and scholarly. It reeked. It stank. It was crawling with hypocrisy and shoddy diplomacy. He took some 30,000 words to indicate that pestilence, famine, and war was in existence. That thieving, murder, and kindred rot was also in evidence. He dithered about the general theme that this was horrible. Tediously he pedanted, hedging around concerning the perfect state, eventually coming out into the open with his own private perfect state plan. Revised and condensed, it still reeked. Get rid of all the misfits and criminals and the insane, prison up all the square pegs and breed them out, and then direct democracy just as the Greeks had. Apparently he had never heard of economics. No one had told him that Greek democracy existed on the basis of a slave system. No one had told him of other things that had either been thought of, worked out, or had evolved according to the scientific laws concerning economics and society since the time of the Greeks. Achilles Maravane was stuck on Homeric Greek democracy, only he indicated that he, personally, would be Democrat number 1. Again we bewilder the reader with a thread from the beginning. Again we return to the Los Angeles camera forum scene. This time to call to the mind of the elated reader that succulent item of femininity that first claimed our attention with her sprightly uncovering of Achilles Maravane as the seemingly innocuous John Smith. We find Cecile Douve, as she is known to the intelligence services of this and perhaps a few other countries, in a stinky little bedroom. Again, don't get ahead of the story. She is merely investigating, not engaged in active inquiry, if you follow me. This stinky little bedroom, with massive volumes of a technical nature, broken test tubes, and other rot and junk of a like nature littering it, is the erstwhile bedroom of Achilles Maravane. He no longer inhabits it, although we can linger nostalgically for a moment, although we can sniff mystifiedly at the peculiar odours emanating from the broken test tubes, although we can tinker with the gimcracks and thingbobs and machinery, and no doubt shock ourselves into a reckoning with Old Scratch. In any case, Cecile Douve is here searching for a clue to the whereabouts of Achilles. The scientist of the galvanometers is also here. His name is Harold Bosco, and he is a PhD. Together, Cecile and the PhD search and also engage in polite converse. They sniff not, mystifiedly or otherwise. They linger not on anything nor brood about the fact that perhaps here, in this very, very room, was conceived the diabolicism of the force wall. No, they search and converse. "It must not happen. The man is a maniac," postulates Cecile prettily, then continues the efficient search. "Honeybunch," evidently the poor egg has joined the clan of the Love-Lawn, "it shall not. I shall find something to combat him and his evil." "Do you think you can do it, my pet?" "Certainly. I'm a scientist, am I not? Just between you and me, and a few governments, author's note. I'm working on something already. I have a magnificent conception that may well prove his downfall." "Do you really think so? You're so wise, so marvellous. Do you really think so? Yes. A pause, then in husky tones, Really? Embraces, osculations, and speeches, at precisely the right moment when his devotion is white hot, she moulds him and sends him back to work. At approximately this same time, there is going on a very important meeting of various high and significant officials of the government, the President, Vice President, Cabinet members, House Committee on Achilles Maravane, Senatorial Investigation Committee on Achilles Maravane, the current successors to the Dies Committee, and the First Lady. Hubbub, clamour, chaos. The authoritative voice of the President lifts. Silence, please. The chairman of the House Committee on Achilles Maravane rises and addresses the President. Mr. President, we are led to believe that these are the facts of the case. There is, or are, a person, or persons, calling himself, or themselves, Achilles Maravane, who has been, or have been, imprisoning prisons, causing no end of annoyance and embarrassment, and who has, or have, proclaimed that purports to be the constitution of a new American state, founded after the manner of our Grecian predecessors in the experiment of democracy. The experiment of democracy, which, may I say, gentlemen, voice takes oratorical tones, has fulfilled all the most rosy hopes and expectations, which has turned a barren wilderness of 13 original states into the magnificence and resplendency of— We are all aware of that, Miss Rainsworth. The President's grimace could rightly be termed sinister. The chairman sits down abruptly, and the President continues. In any event, gentlemen, we are confronted by a profoundly serious situation, coming as it is at a time when we should bend every effort toward preparing for a war against the old world. This person, or persons, known as Achilles Maravane, is having a distressingly diverting effect upon us when all energies from that madman in Europe. Beyond doubt, he is some pseudo-idealistic radical, perhaps an emissary of the Federation. Whatever he is, he has no full cognizance of the extreme gravity of our situation, and, as such, will not assist us. Thus he, or they, must be destroyed. What might any of you gentlemen suggest toward the speedy expedition of this destruction? The First Lady arises. I'm not a gentleman, she simpers, but— Quite true. Sit down, please. Wait a moment. I have something to suggest. Perhaps you do not realize it, but I am indirectly responsible for the uncovering of Achilles Maravane in Smith's clothing. It was one of my girls, Cecile Douve, who did the job, and we, she in active duty, and I as a patron, are continuing our efforts. As once she wormed her way into his affections, so shall she do it again. As once she effectively uncovered him, so shall she do a second time. I really promise you results, gentlemen. Results. And results she got. Results they were. The web, the power expended, the intricacies of thought, the drive of 500 individuals were her results. The huge rolling mass of energy that was exhausted by 500 highly specialized and superbly trained and educated beings was the result she directed against the insidious Mr. Maravane. And, most important of all, one person named Cecile Douve. 499 engineers, scientists, technicians, and one little lump of hotshot generally known as Cecile Douve. I love you, she said. Achilles replied, The last time I believed that, you called in the FBI as witnesses to our mutual affection. I was mad, my darling. I didn't understand you. Hushed, reverent tones. Even then, I felt violently attracted to you as a man, but your purposes and powers seemed so fearful. I thought you were a madman, and myself a monster to love you, but now I know. When I read your wonderful proclamation, I realized how wrong I had been, how gentle and idealistic you are. I understood then your purity, and realized the nobility of your aspirations. I love you." She moved in for the clinch. "It would only be fair to warn you," he replied, "that I still have the force screen armoring me. Cuddling under these conditions would be quite inadvisable." She recoiled in a somewhat unamorous fashion. "Still," he continued, "I love you too. I don't want to trust you, but I do. Don't look hopeful, my dear. I don't completely. Just to a certain reasonable degree. So, here's what. If my noble aspirations pan out, as I can't help to expect they will, I'll marry you. In the meantime, we can be friends. We can conduct a pleasant, frolicky little association, however, an entirely platonic one." He sighed. "Would that Homer were alive today to write the story of Achilles' Maravain as it should be written. Will I have poets worthy of me?" This, she thought, could go on indefinitely. "How soon will it be?" she broke in. "When will you succeed? Can you make it very soon, my dearest?" "It can't be any too soon for me, either, Dewdrop, but restrain yourself." "I can't! Oh, I can't!" she cried, heavy breathing, then in more serious tones. "I know what to do. I have influence in Washington. I'll arrange an audience for you with the President. With the President and all of Congress. They'll see you." "Nice of them, but I don't see the use of it." "It might be of inestimable use, my darling. A direct impact of your personality and honesty and drive should convince them. It would be almost certain to convince them. They're only human, my dear. And think of the time and trouble we can save if they are ready to give in gracefully. Please." "Very well," he sighed. "I'll do it. Don't think for a moment I don't suspect treachery, my pet. But after all, I am invincible. You know that, I hope." And on this note ends the reconciliation, immediately followed by much ado. Preparations while 499 engineers, etc., work in a veritable frenzy. And out of their efforts and energy there grows an amphitheatre, large and capacious, pretty and modern, beautiful. This was to be the scene of the meeting. Here is to be decided the fate of more than 130 million people. Here is to be expounded the rules and laws of a state founded on Grecian lines, on the classic examples. Here, on March 15th. Beware of the Ides of March, O Caesar! Glorious, powerful, invincible Achilles' Maravain comes to the amphitheatre. Nowadays, with the details and obscurities of the episode in history shuffled into relative inconspicuity, one doesn't know precisely how the cards fell, or get the subtleties of the deal. Did any soothsayers annoy our equivalent of Caesar on his route? Did his non-existent Calpurnia dream glorily the night before? Did lionesses whelp in the streets? Or did fierce fiery warriors fight upon the clouds, which drizzled blood upon the Capitol? Gangway for Homer, or even Shakespeare. Either of these two could have done justice to our play. In any case, Achilles ignored whatever omens there might have been, and came to the amphitheatre on March 15. Cecile met him at the great modern-looking portal, and led him in, introducing him to her benefactress, the First Lady, who in turn consummated the formalities with the President himself. Achilles was very well behaved throughout these presentations, conducting himself with decorum and considerations for all the people who eyed his much-publicized armor with especial dubiety. He was very pleased with himself about the whole thing. All these key figures, these obstructions to his philosophy, this destructible humanity, ponderous, ripe, so to speak, for explosions and force walls, and he showing such admirable restraint about it all. Indeed, he felt content. Restraint, control, self-discipline. These his watchwords. The President didn't take him by the hand, the force wall preventing, but he did the next best thing. He preceded him to the raised dais in the centre of the amphitheatre, and from the spot delivered a fetching little introduction about which no more severe a criticism can be applied than superfluous. After this, Achilles began his talk. Here also is the ubiquitous scientist of the lost-looking face, apparently a member, if not a chieftain, of the clan of the 499 technicians. He is looking remarkably heroic at the moment, almost gigantic, in a spiritual sort of way. He turns and throws a switch. And, in the amphitheatre, a globular hemisphere descends upon the dais supporting Achilles Maravine, immediately transforming him into a raging Achilles, a half-spheroid, transparent, glassy, but immensely malleable and tensile and strong. Upstairs in the little room in which stands the heroic and lost-looking scientist, the door flies open. Cecile Douve, betrayer extraordinary, Hotshot extraordinary, flies into his arms. "Darling, the hemisphere is cracking. He's winning out. What'll it do to me?" All this excitedly. Then, ruminatively, almost sadly, "He won't want to marry me now." "Never fear, my sweetness," replied the chieftain of the 499. "We will win out. Earth science shall triumph. The hemisphere's just makeshift, to hold him in one spot for a minute or two. Earth'll really get going in a sec. Earth is insuperable. Classicism he wanted, and classicism he'll get. Remember the first Achilles? He had a vulnerable spot. His heel." The lost look was replaced by a malevolent grin, sage and content. "Achilles Maravane has a heel too. It couldn't be protected by the force wall, could it? He doesn't walk on an inch of apparent nothingness, does he? No, he's vulnerable, just as his Homeric predecessor, and we don't have to use clumsy poisoned arrows on this," sneering emphasis, "heel." A wild laugh. "We just throw a shot of good old electricity into him." On the dais, the violent, raging figure of John Smith, Elias Achilles Maravane, Colossus of the classics, exponent of the ages, Caesar omnipotent, stiffens convulsively as a couple of 100,000 volts of electricity crisps his flesh. For a long moment, what is left of him remains upright. Then, quietly, it falls. Achilles number 2 seeks out his illustrious predecessor in Elysia. The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Death of a Mutant by Charles V. DeVette. Originally published in Super Science Fiction, February 1957. Narrated by Tom Trussel. The boy stood on the low hill with his head tipped back and his throat exposed to the early morning chill. He was dressed in faded trousers, from which most of the tan colouring had long since been washed away, and a coarse blue denim work shirt. The wind swept his blonde hair back in loose, flat waves, and with soft insistence tugged at his slack-limbed body. He spread his legs wide and breathed the morning air deep into his lungs. When he expelled the breath, his shoulders relaxed, and his arms dropped to his sides without strength. Slowly, with an effort of will, he brought his attention back to his surroundings. Below him, a dog began an excited barking. The barking changed abruptly to a yelp and stopped. The boy straightened and drew back a step. Down below, a figure darted suddenly from a low patch of brush and ran to another, kicking up splashes of red sand. To his right, a man's voice sounded a sharp cry of warning. The boy shivered. Somewhere below him, a bird repeated, monotonously, a brief ripple of song. After a few minutes, a block-chested man stepped into view. His shoulders were hunched in a black leather jacket. He looked apprehensively up at the boy. When nothing happened, he called, "I'm coming up. Keep your hands in plain sight." He started up the hill, measuring his steps purposefully. Once he paused and pulled at his broad-brimmed hat, then came on resolutely. There was a day's growth of whiskers on the man's chin and jowls, and despite the cold, a shiny film of perspiration glistened on his cheeks. He drew a pistol from a chest holster as he approached. 2 paces away, the man halted. "I'm Sheriff Derwin," he said in a stilted, abnormal voice. "I'm placing you under arrest. Do not resist. We have you surrounded." The boy made no reply, but continued to watch the man, blinking several times, as though considering what had been said. After a minute, he spread his hands wide in a weary motion of acquiescence. "Good," Derwin gestured. 3 men left their places in the brush and began to move cautiously up the hill. "I'll have to search him," Derwin said over his shoulder. His voice was too loud in the morning air. "Keep him covered. Remember, he's a killer." He holstered his own gun and moved unwillingly closer to the boy. "Raise your hands." The boy did as he was told. Derwin patted him quickly about the chest and hips. The examination was only barely adequate. "When we take him in," Derwin said, "careful not to get too near him. He can kill you, just with his hands. Stay out of reach." Derwin put his prisoner in one of the 3 cells in White Bear Lake's jail. The boy offered no resistance. He stood with his head resting wearily against one of the steel bars and watched without apparent interest as his cell door was locked. But when Derwin made as though to leave, he straightened and his features livened. His expression became one not quite of pleading and not quite a question, but rather a hopeful expectation, as though he had some deep need which he expected Derwin to recognize. The sheriff stood for a minute, meeting the boy's intent gaze, then shrugged and went on toward his office. He limped a little. An old kneecap injury had been aggravated by his chase of the boy, and now it was swollen and stiff. The boy was lying on the floor of his cell, asleep, when the sheriff came back with a platter of food. Derwin unlocked the door quietly, brought the food in, and set it on a table in one corner of the cell. As quietly, he let himself out again. Standing in the corridor, with the locked door again between them, he called, "Wake up!" The boy's body did not move, but his eyes opened wide. With their instant awareness, they were like the eyes of a big cat in a zoo, but without the cat's easy hatred. "Your dinner's on the table," Derwin said. The boy rose swiftly to his feet and looked around him. He saw the food, went over, and began eating. He used his hands, eating the meat first in great wolfing bites. When the meat was gone, he ate the potatoes. He tasted the moist cabbage salad, but did not eat it. Derwin watched him for the few minutes it took. "I guess they never taught you to use a knife and fork," he murmured, half to himself. The boy came to the cell door and grasped the bars in his big hands. He looked at Derwin, and his expression was the same expectant one that had been so disturbing earlier. The sheriff had stepped back, out of reach, as the boy approached. "Did you want something?" he asked. The boy made no reply. "Can you understand what I say?" Derwin asked. After a brief puzzled pause, the boy nodded. "You can?" Derwin asked doubtfully. "I know you mutants had some way of communicating with each other without speaking, but I thought the profs at the university decided you couldn't understand us." He seemed to make a sudden decision. "I'll be right back," he said. Derwin returned to his office and picked up his desk chair, carried it to the corridor opposite the boy's cell, and sat down. "If you do understand what I say, maybe we can have some kind of confab. Can you speak?" The boy made no reply. "No, I guess you can't," Derwin said, "or they'd have found out about it before this." He considered a moment. "How about us setting up some kind of code?" he suggested. "I'll ask questions, and you nod if I'm right, and shake your head if I'm wrong." The boy made no answer, except for his continued expectant gaze. Derwin shrugged. "Okay, if you can't, you can't. The profs had a theory that you couldn't understand what they said, but that you got some of the meaning of the words from the sound and the inflections." Still there was no response. "Maybe you can read my mind?" Derwin waited a moment. "You're a strange one, whatever the answers might be. When you 8 mutants were found in the Lost Islands area of the Lake of the Woods, the doctor who had brought you there, evidently when you were very young, had been dead for years. He had been a famous genetic specialist and had probably cared for you from birth. The profs even believe he must have influenced your development before birth. Anyway, there was no doubt that you were all geniuses of a high order. But there was a screw loose somewhere. When you were brought to the University of Minnesota, you soon turned into a pack of murderers. And you were brilliant enough to get by with it for months before the authorities learned what you were doing. The other 7 were killed, either fighting or trying to get away. You're the last one left now. Wouldn't you like to make your peace before it's too late for you too?" There was no suggestion of truculence or stubbornness in the boy's lack of response. It was as though Derwin's statements had not merited answers, or that the answers had been too obvious to need saying. Derwin leaned back in his chair and folded his hands across his stomach. "All right," he said. "If you aren't interested in that, let's get back to your immediate problem. You know what you were arrested for?" He did not wait for an answer. "You're accused of killing at least 30 people," he said, "and they have plenty of proof, enough to hang you. I'd say your only defense would be that you didn't know what you were doing." Derwin made an impatient motion to rise. "Oh, there's no use going on," he said. "Either you can't understand me, or you know all this already." Abruptly the boy was nodding his head, nodding it vigorously. Derwin remained sitting. "Why are you doing that?" he asked. The boy blinked his eyes, pressing the lids tightly together and opening them again. "What's that mean? Do you want help of some kind?" Derwin paused. "I'd like to do what I can, but if you don't tell me or show me, how can I help you? If you have any way of communicating, use it now, or we'll never get anywhere." The boy's forehead creased with lines of effort. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Derwin ran his fingers along the stubble of his jawline. "I suppose if the profs and psychiatrists at the U couldn't find a way to talk with you, I can't. I understand when they couldn't learn how you mutants read minds, or even if you did, they tried to teach you to speak and to live like human beings. You couldn't or wouldn't learn either. You wouldn't work, and nothing seemed to interest you, until toward the end you turned surly, and scratched and even bit people who annoyed you. Derwin paused again. "Have I touched on what's troubling you yet?" The boy moistened his lips and nodded, his face eager. With a puzzled shake of his head, Derwin tried again. "All right. The first person your group killed, I've read, might have been the doctor who raised you. Though personally I don't believe that. But there's no doubt that you did kill others." Derwin frowned. A smile had come to the boy's face as he listened, as though he was recalling something pleasant. The sheriff cocked his head to one side and shifted his position. He spoke with less enthusiasm now. "After the others were killed, they lost all trace of you until the day you visited Anchor Hospital in St. Paul. The attendants there didn't recognize you and assumed you were just another visitor. But when you left, 27 patients were dead." A small shiver ran through the muscles of Derwin's back. The smile had returned to the boy's pink cheeks, a smile almost of delight. Derwin leaned forward, making no effort to hide his annoyance as he spoke. "You'll hang for those killings," he said. "We still don't know how you do it, but the other patients in some of those wards saw you put your hands on the people who died and saw them go limp. They didn't realize at the time that you had killed them." The smile on the boy's face was as tranquil as the smile of a cherub. A flow of angry blood crept into Derwin's face. "Just in case they can't pin any of those murders on you," he said, "we sure as hell can convict you of the 3 here in White Bear Lake." Derwin pulled himself to his feet. "I'll do my best to see that you hang for them," he said deliberately. His voice was low and flat. He limped away, dragging his chair at his side. The boy's expression of urgent request changed to one of reproach when he realized that Derwin was leaving. Disappointment showed bleakly on his face. It was as though he had expected something more from Derwin. The next morning Derwin drove in the last car in a funeral procession and waited at the fringe of the crowd as the coffin was lowered into the ground. The deceased had been the last victim of the boy killer. The mourners filed out quickly after the services, and Derwin found no opportunity that would not have involved an awkward intrusion to talk with any of them. However, as he walked slowly back to his car, a young man of about 25 drove up in an old automobile and parked at the edge of the grave. He got out from behind the wheel of the vehicle and went around to the back. From the trunk he removed a shovel and carried it to the grave. He nodded to the sheriff and began pushing dirt from the edge into the hole. Derwin strolled over and stood across the open grave from the shoveler. Neither spoke until the young man stopped to wipe his forehead. "You're the sheriff, aren't you?" he asked Derwin. Derwin nodded. "I understand you think the wild boy killed Carl." The young man inclined his head toward the grave. "Was Carl his first name?" Derwin answered non-committally. "Yes, Carl Van Sistine. He was a good friend of mine. When we were kids we used to play here, right in this graveyard. We hunted rabbits with slingshots. I don't remember that we ever killed any. We were always going to make a fire and roast the rabbits we shot, but as I said, we never got any." Derwin waited. "The wild boy didn't kill him." "What makes you think not?" Derwin asked. "No one saw him do it, but 2 witnesses did see him run out of the house, and they found Carl dead right after." "I know that." The young man rolled his shirt sleeves up over hairy forearms. "But did you know that Carl had something wrong with his head? A tumour or something. He'd had it ever since he was a little boy. Sometimes we'd be playing, and all at once he'd stop dead still. If there was a chair or anything that moved around, he'd grab it and holler for me to hold on to the other end. I'd hold it, and he'd pull until he couldn't hang on any more. Then he'd fall over backwards. He'd lay there with his eyes rolled back until all I could see were the whites. His face would be pale and screwed up looking, and sweat would come out all over his body. His clothes would be wet with it. All the time he'd be groaning and crying." The young man took off his striped workman's cap and ran his fingers through wavy brown hair. "The last few years he couldn't leave the house. I used to visit him at first, but at last he didn't even recognize me. When his attacks came on, he'd holler with pain, and finally I couldn't stand to hear him any more. That's what he died from, the tumour in his head, and not the wild boy killing him." "The doctors said it shouldn't have killed him, yet," Derwin demurred. "I know, but the doctors were wrong." The young man began shoveling dirt into the hole again. The sun was directly overhead when Derwin climbed out of his car, pushing his game leg stiffly ahead of him. He went up the flight of steps at the front of a large white house and pressed the button beside the door. He rang 3 times without an answer. On the way back down the steps, he heard the sound of iron on iron coming from the back of the house. He walked around and found an old man with stooped shoulders throwing horseshoes at a peg set in the ground. "Good afternoon," Derwin said. The old man paused in his throwing and nodded in reply. "I'd like to talk to you again about your sister's death," Derwin said. "I presume you heard that we caught her killer." The old man sighted a shoe carefully and threw at a farther peg. "Will you tell me again just what happened?" Derwin asked. "I was sitting with her when he came in." The old man had a red face and neck with a border of white just above the collar line. "He hadn't knocked. At least I didn't hear him. Just all at once he was standing by the bed, smiling. I was going to say something, but he looked at my sister, then at me, and he seemed so young and kind of fresh-looking that I just smiled back. Then he sat on the bed alongside Louise and put his hand on her chest, and she closed her eyes, and her moaning stopped. For the first time in almost a week. I didn't know until after he'd gone that she was dead." "How did it happen you didn't report her death to my office? We only learned about it from the doctor." The old man's attention seemed absorbed by something on the roof of a neighbouring house. He stood for several minutes, then slowly looked down at his hand in mild surprise. He had been gripping and twisting an iron shoe in his hand so hard that a corner had cut a ragged gash in the meaty forepart of his thumb. Blood flowed from the cut down the end of the shoe and dripped sluggishly to the ground. Irritably, the old man tossed the shoe aside and took a handkerchief from a rear pocket of his trousers and wrapped it around the injured thumb. "I was glad she died," he said, half defiantly. Derwin's eyebrows raised questioningly. "That may sound heartless," the old man's voice was mild now, "but it isn't. My sister had cancer, had it bad. She was dying from it, and she was suffering horribly. Even drugs gave her no relief toward the last. During her periods of consciousness she begged the doctor to give her something so she could die, but he wouldn't. I asked him to put her out of her misery too, but he wouldn't listen to me either. Mr. Derwin," the old man brought his face closer to Derwin's, "every human being should have the right to die. When the time comes that medicine can't help them any more, and they have nothing to look forward to except suffering, they should be allowed to die if they want to." Abruptly he turned his back and walked into the house. Dusk was edging into darkness when Derwin reached the home of the boy's third victim. The family lived in an upper duplex apartment. A large wreath hung on the apartment door. The woman who answered his knock was middle-aged, with dark hair and dark eyes, and quick, nervous hands. "Come in," she invited listlessly, as she recognized the sheriff. Derwin followed her to a chair in the front room and sat down. "Can you give me any details of your husband's death that you might not have remembered when I was here before?" he asked. "You've got to see that maniac pays for his killings." The woman spoke rapidly, excitedly, ignoring the sheriff's questions. "If you don't, I'll—" Her voice broke, and she began to cry. After a few minutes, she wiped her eyes with a square of tissue which she took from her apron pocket. "I'm all right now," she said. "What do you want to know?" "Anything you remember. You might tell me first what time of day it happened." "About the same time in the evening as now," the woman answered. "We had already finished eating. George was lying here on the davenport, and I—" "Pardon me a minute," Derwin interrupted. "How ill was your husband?" "He was too sick to work, though he could still get around a little. He had silicosis of the lungs, you know." Derwin nodded. "Go on, please." The woman needed no urging. Apparently she enjoyed talking. "Where was I? Oh, yes. I heard something scratching at the door. It sounded like a cat, and I went to see what it was. The boy was standing there, smiling. I didn't know who he was then. He looked so young and so sweet-like that I didn't ask what he wanted. I just let him come in. When George saw him, I thought at first that he knew him, because he sat up straight and spoke to the boy. He said something like, 'So you've come.' He looked glad, as though he was happy. Then he changed and looked scared, but he didn't say anything more, and neither did the boy. Finally he sort of relaxed and sighed and let himself ease back on the davenport. He asked me to make a pot of coffee, and I left and went into the kitchen." The woman stopped and blew her nose. "That's all, except that the boy was gone when I came back, and George was dead." Derwin looked down at the hat on his lap and searched for a way to express what he wanted to say. At last he looked up. "Some people believe the mutants killed only people who were very sick, people who had no chance to live anyway and probably wanted to die quickly?" His voice rose doubtfully as he finished. "That's not true." There was no expression in the woman's flat voice. "I read where they killed some that weren't sick at all, and how would they know how sick the others were, or if they wanted to die?" "How about your husband?" "George did suffer quite a bit, but I'm certain he never wanted to die." "Was there any chance that he might have recovered from his particular illness?" "The doctors said not, but what right did that boy have to play God and kill him? How do any of us know that there won't be a new treatment or a new drug discovered maybe next week or next month that could have saved George? What justification can you have for a cold-blooded murderer like that?" Derwin looked down again at his hat and shifted his feet uncomfortably. The woman said, "George had a pension that supported us, but it stopped when he died. How am I going to live now? Who's going to support my children or take care of them while I work?" There was still no emotion in the woman's voice, but tears which she disregarded ran down her cheeks. Derwin stood up. "I don't know," he said. "I was just wondering if what seems wrong to us might not seem right to him." He apologized. The next morning, Derwin stopped in at a store at Matomedi Avenue and bought a pair of trousers, a shirt, a set of underwear, and a pair of socks. 2 doors down, he stopped in at another store and bought a pair of shoes. He drove to the jail and shoved the clothing through the bars to the boy. "Here's something better for you to wear," he said, and walked on to his office. The boy carried his bundle to the rear of the cell and began changing. He was buttoning his shirt when he glanced through the small barred window in the wall and saw Derwin crossing the street toward a corner lunchroom. A flush of excitement appeared on his cheeks, and he finished dressing hurriedly. Moving to the front of the cell, he spread out his right hand and flexed the fingers several times. His face assumed an expression of deep abstraction. A faint haze began to waver along the edges of the hand, and its flesh appeared to move in small ripples. The boy pressed the hand against the door lock, and it passed through the metal. The lock gave a muted metallic click. The door swung open. The boy's hand returned to its normal appearance as he withdrew it, but it hung limp and pale. He massaged it vigorously as he stepped out into the jail corridor. He was careful not to let himself be seen when he left the jail. An hour later, he had left White Bear Lake. When Derwin returned to the jail and found the boy gone, he was not much surprised. He walked slowly to his office and picked up the phone. "Let me speak to the sheriff," he said. "Gibbons? This is Derwin out at White Bear Lake." "Fine. The wild boy escaped about an hour ago. He sprung his cell lock some way." "No, I don't know which way he went, but I figured he might head back to St. Paul." "Okay. I wish you'd do me a favor. Ask your men and the police not to shoot him. I'm sure he won't resist when you arrest him." "I know. He sighed. "That's right. You have to do what you think best." He hung up. The boy went directly from the jail to the railroad tracks, nearly a mile past the depot. He hid in the weeds along the track until a slow freight passed, then climbed into the open door of a boxcar. The string of freight cars was cut out of the train in the St. Paul yards. The boy stayed inside his car until several hours after dark, when he left his hiding place and went along the Mississippi, past Carlson's Landing, and up to the post office. There he stopped and seemed to be deciding what he should do next. A half-block away, a policeman was checking the tires of parked cars. The boy saw him and began walking rapidly in the opposite direction. He hesitated at the street corner, then walked boldly out into the lighted area of the intersection. He had nearly reached the opposite sidewalk when he heard a shout behind him. He began to run. A police whistle sounded shrilly. When the boy entered the park, he appeared to wander casually, with his interest centered on no particular person or place. But his steps took him down a diagonal walk that led to the young mother and the carriage. The child of about 6 inside the carriage had a large head that wobbled spasmodically above its thin frame. The boy walked past the mother without attracting her attention, and bent toward the child. A terrified scream at his side jerked him erect. "The beast!" the woman screamed with all the power in her lungs. She sprang at the boy, still screaming, and dug clawed fingers into his cheeks. "Get away from him, you beast! You horrible beast!" Fear blossomed up into the boy's face at the woman's scream. He pushed her aside and glared wildly about him. The nearest exit from the park was just ahead. Swiftly he put his head down and scurried through the exit. Once in the street, he increased his speed and ran for 6 blocks past the auditorium and across 7 corners until the breath whistled in his throat. As he staggered to a stop, a police siren sounded behind him. The boy forced his tired legs to move again and sprinted down an alley that opened to his left. Halfway through the alley, he heard the screech of tires behind him, and the police siren was at his back. He came to a low fence bordering the alley between an apartment building and an older private home. Without pausing, he rested a hand on the fence railing and vaulted over. Beneath him, as he hung suspended, he saw a child's large sandbox. His right foot, with his weight behind it, landed on the handle of a toy wagon, and his ankle twisted painfully under him. He sprawled forward, ripping the skin of his forearm on the side of the sandbox as he fell. As quickly as he was able, he pulled himself to his feet and limped across the yard, past the small house and out into the street. The police siren still sounded behind him, and now another started up in the block ahead. He turned to the right and ran with all the speed he could command. A block ahead loomed the Mississippi. With his last remaining strength, he stumbled toward it. A police car arrived just as he dived into the murky water. 2 policemen scrambled from the car and ran toward the river bank. Sergeant Robert Kirk pulled his pistol from its holster as the boy's head reappeared above the water. "Halt!" he shouted. "Halt, or I'll shoot!" The boy never paused. Kirk brought the gun up and sighted along the barrel. The boy's head came in line with the small V of the sight. "For the last time, halt!" The boy's head turned up. His wet blonde hair shone in the sunlight. Kirk squeezed the trigger. Simultaneously with the report, the boy's hair sprang upward in startled protest. His arms gave one reflective jerk, and his face turned toward the sky. Slowly, slowly, the white features sank beneath the water. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. The Deadly Ones by F.L. Wallace. Originally published in Fantastic Universe, July 1954. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Rathston. I'm sure the name means nothing to you. There are legends, of course, from old Germany and the Greater Reich, colonial America even, but you can't prove anything very damaging or concrete with legends. And even when the story is otherwise correct, I've been careful to keep my name out of it. A clever person shuns publicity, though it may involve tampering with history. For all practical purposes, the name Rathston is unknown. I want it kept that way. I can't remember when the inspiration came. Probably it had lain for a long time dormant in the back of my mind, like a mole hibernating in mid-winter. Warmed by the proper circumstances, it emerged at last in its full vigour to claim my attention. I've always worked hard, but lately what I got out of my efforts you couldn't call a living. The Red Cross was largely responsible. You could never get me to say a good word for that agency. Never. Still, I have made use of them, and in this case they made their contribution, though it was an unwitting one. I gave the idea careful thought. From the beginning I knew I needed help. I'm not superhuman, not in the strict sense, though I suppose I could give a good account of myself against Wells's Invisible Man, Homo Superior, or the new crop of mutants that will spring up some day soon. I needed help, and I carried the problem to a council of my fellows. We discussed it thoroughly, and in the end, though they didn't give me their blessing, they consented to aid me. The problem was flying saucers, or rather, how to force one to land. We debated the matter for a long time, but there didn't seem to be any way to do it. No jet could keep up with a saucer, and present rockets were equally inadequate. Besides, we didn't have access to any of these machines. Someone in the back of the council, whose name I didn't catch, suggested that, if we couldn't force one to land, perhaps we could lure one down. It didn't matter how, as long as it remained on the ground for an hour or so, with its ports open. The rest would be up to me. Fine, I said. What do you propose? They're investigating, you know, he said, in the western part of the country. Rocket bases, atom bomb sites, anything that indicates advanced technology. Let's give them another menace. Sounds good. What are they interested in? He was a hard fellow to locate, and I didn't try to visualize his face. He came from Ireland, I believe. A spaceship, he said. A very formidable creation, with an incredible drive. There was nothing wrong with the basic concept. The ship wouldn't be real, of course. It would merely seem real from the air. We could accomplish that. As for the drive, we could manage that too. In a little investigated part of the spectrum, we could create a low and steady output, suggesting that the drive was idling, ready for instant takeoff. None of this was impossible for us. We? Have I said that we're not human? We've existed for a long time on Earth beside Homo sapiens, and he has only dimly guessed that we are here. The ordinary limitations of men don't apply to us. A few of us working together could create an illusionary spaceship, and an intriguing drive to go with it. This was something flying saucers couldn't resist. They'd come down where they found they couldn't investigate from their customary high-level flights. I nodded at the fellow I couldn't see. Excellent. However, when the saucer lands, you'll have to maintain the illusion. Logistics are involved too. That's easy, he said. But what if it isn't manned by robots, as you've assumed? You can get inside all right, but a living creature will discover you. I looked at the blank spot where I thought he might be. Really now, it has to be a robot. No living creature, except us, can stand the accelerations we've observed. But what if we're wrong? He persisted. In that case, we'll have time for one quick look, I said. If it is living and we're no match for it, we'll run like hell. There was general laughter, and the fellow raised no further objections. For all I know, he went home. The meeting broke up, and everyone except a few volunteers left. We continued to discuss ways and means. When the plans seemed foolproof, I got up. "Just a minute," another fellow I didn't recognize interposed. "Suppose everything works the way you say it will. The saucer lands, and you succeed in getting inside. What makes you think it'll go back to the home planet?" "Don't overlook our fake spaceship," I said. "If the robot investigator from the saucer found a real spaceship, that would be important information. It would be important enough to warrant a quick trip back to the local base, wherever that may be situated. But when the robot can't locate anything, in spite of the evidence on the instruments, it will be dealing with top priority stuff. Logically, it will have to report back to the Prime Evaluation Center on the home planet. I think I'm safe in anticipating a short journey." "I hope so." He shook his head dubiously. "But what about us? We don't have to worry about humans, and probably those things out there haven't come close enough to learn about us. But they're pretty advanced. What if they should?" "You think they can detect us when we're dematerialized?" I smiled. "Don't be naive. Anyway, nothing risked, you know." I shouldn't have said that. I talk too much. "Nothing gained," he completed the sentence for me. He didn't look altruistic. "Just what do we stand to gain?" The others hadn't thought of it, and neither had I, from that angle. I ad-libbed. "It's not been good here lately. There's too many factors against us, agencies that I don't have to mention. Feast or famine, mostly the last. And what are we going to do after an atomic war when mutants come along? Are you sure we can compete with them? As bad as it is now, it can get worse." I paused to let the dire predictions sink in. "Someone has to do it, and I intend to be the one to find new worlds for us," I said. My confidence impressed the others, but not the heckler. "I can see that you'll find it for yourself, but how are you going to let us know?" "Just now, I can't communicate from here to Philadelphia," I said. "It's a harassing business, merely trying to stay alive. Here, I haven't had time to practice mental communication. But there, conditions will be ideal, and I expect to develop myself so that I can reach out anywhere in the galaxy." Objectively, that was true. Subjectively, I could have changed my mind about sharing my prize. They didn't think of that, and I didn't mention it. The last objection was silenced. They went about their preparations, and I about mine. We set up the decoy in Illinois. No real reason, I suppose, except that most of us are allergic to desert. The logical place to build spaceport and ships. Deserts are hot, dry, and bright, and there are few humans there. In our own way, we're fond of men, though they may not think so. Illinois it was, and if there was a note of incongruity in it, so much the better. A spaceship looked strange in the middle of the flat cornfields. Very well, it did. Let the robot investigator find out why it was there. The creation was not difficult. There was a haze in the air, and the fields were green, and the spaceship pointed a sleek nose toward the sky. It was impalpable from below. A farmer ploughed right through the stern tubes without knowing they were there. An inconvenience only. We blacked him out as seen from above. The farmhouse we converted into a control tower, and the barn became a disembarkation structure. There were side manifestations, of course. Dogs growled uneasily and barked, then ran away and hid in the woods. Roosters could not crow, nor hens lay eggs. Milk curdled in cows in cans, and all the butter turned rancid. Unfortunately, we don't often use our entire minds, and when we do, there are peripheral effects. However, no human in the area noticed us, and life went on pretty much as usual. Radio reception was poor over all North America, and television was disrupted for 1,000 miles. The disruption was deliberately planned. We had to attract the attention of the sources, and that was the easiest way to do it. The radiation was supposed to represent a power leak from a hypothetical interstellar drive. They came the second night, and it was good they did. The strain was telling on everyone in the project. It's not easy to keep up such big illusion. The flight of saucers wheeled across the sky, lights out and undoubtedly ready for action. They had located us all right, and they wanted to see just what it was we had. But they couldn't find out from the air, no matter how many times they passed over. It must have been quite a jolt. They had Earth all pegged down to the last improvement in a self-locking nut, and suddenly here was something new which didn't belong. Toward midnight, with 5 of them still skimming the clouds, the 6th came down. I was ready, and had everything I needed with me. The saucer landed in a field a half-mile away. The vegetation burned invisibly where it settled. A section of the saucer opened, and a much littler saucer came out. The little saucer was a robot. I was sure of that the instant I saw it, mostly because it had wheels. There is nothing to indicate that a life form can't have wheels, but it does pose a nice problem for what a living creature will use for bearings. It was a robot then, and it came out and headed for our ship, which was still holding together splendidly, needle nose aimed at the sky. It was time for me to go to work. I started toward the big saucer. "It's coming closer!" This was the thought of the individual who had created the ship out of his own dematerialized atoms. "Put out a force field and keep it away." He sounded shaky, and I thought a wry jest would help. The containers I was carrying were heavy. The ship snorted. "I wish I could, but seriously, how long do I have to stay here?" "Keep it up," I said. "I've got lots of supplies." The terror in his voice was real. "I don't like that thing. It's snooping around." "Waken the farmer. Maybe he'll kick up a disturbance and the robot will investigate." With a shotgun, the farmer couldn't do much, but a lucky shot might put a wheel out of commission. The robot wouldn't like that. "I can't make the farmer open his eyes. The saucer put him to sleep, and I can't touch his mind." The saucers had a good brand of hypnotism, if that's what it was. We knew they had space travel, and now it was evident that they were equally advanced in other ways. "Use your judgment," I told the ship. "Hold it as long as you can, and then pretend to go out into space, or forward in time. Anything that would look good." I needed time. I could have dematerialized where I stood, and rematerialized inside the saucer. But if I did, I would have to leave most of my supplies behind. A short journey, I had said. And that was true. Short as far as interstellar distances were concerned. But it would be long by normal methods of reckoning, and I had to live through it. I couldn't abandon my supplies. I succeeded in transponding all the food to a place just outside the large saucer before our ship disappeared. It didn't go out into space, nor into time as I expected. Instead, it sank rapidly into the ground and left no hole behind. This, I think, confused the robot. I heard it thrashing around in the cornfield, possibly in bewilderment. I gathered some of the containers and carried them inside the saucer. It was lighted all right, and the lighting scheme was as weird as the interior. They used the spectrum below the red and above the violet. Why this should be so, I don't know. I merely report what I found. Apparently, they didn't react to what we consider visible light. I adjusted my eyes. I found an empty space, which I assumed was for the storage of specimens. I put my food in there. Outside, I went for more, and then back again. I repeated my trips until everything was loaded. Unpalatable food, of course, concentrated and not tasty, but it would last until I stepped out on the planet at the opposite end. After that, there would be other problems. I went outside for the last communication with my fellows. The ship I could examine later. I looked around. The control tower and disembarkation structure were still visible, though they were wavering in the dim light. "Are you there?" I thought. "I am," the control tower thought back. "I wish I wasn't." "It's just a robot," I said reassuringly. "It's not interested in a building." "Maybe not," conceded the control tower, "but it's inside, examining sleeping people. I wish it would go away." He was losing control of himself, and that didn't suit my purpose. "It's just a machine. Hold on for a little longer." He held on. The robot left the illusionary control tower and headed toward the saucer. For a squat, ungainly contrivance, it covered the distance in an amazing fashion. I had barely time to get inside before it rumbled into the saucer. It was carrying something. We took off before I could see what it was. We left Earth smoothly, though any kind of takeoff would have suited me. Inertia had never been my problem. Neither was the possibility that the robot would discover me. I was certain I didn't register on light-sensitive cells, and I had other tricks I could use if I had to. The robot had tentacles I hadn't noticed before, because they had been retracted. They weren't retracted now, and they held a farmer. He was unconscious. The robot was monkeying around with the farmer, but it was hardly the time to interfere. Needles stabbed the farmer in several places, withdrawing the blood and storing it, probably inside the robot. The first needles were jerked out and replaced by others. Again, this was logical. Pumping a fluid into the farmer's veins with the intent of suspending the life force until they reached the home planet. The whole procedure made sense. When the robot couldn't find the spaceship, it had taken someone in the vicinity for questioning. They'd be surprised what they'd learn from the farmer, though. Absolutely nothing. We had protected ourselves too well. The farmer's ordeal had no bearing on the success of my enterprise. Nevertheless, I became slightly ill at the waste involved. The robot dropped the farmer in a place similar to the one in which I had hidden my supplies. Then it crouched down and became motionless, waiting. There was nothing for it to do. Nor for myself either. We were out of the atmosphere and on our way. The journey was 6 months of monotony. Avoiding the robot was easy, because it didn't move. The ship was all mine, but I couldn't make use of it. I puttered around, but there was nothing much to learn. The drive was in operation, and as long as it was, I couldn't get close. I had no idea of what it was, nor how it worked, but the force that surrounded it was, for me at least, an absolute barrier. The rest of the saucer was equally confounding. There were several low-ceilinged compartments which held instruments at whose function I could not guess. There were no star charts anywhere, but I had to assume the ship knew where it was going. Whatever our destination, we were approaching it faster than light. Occasionally I looked out of the vision ports, and what I saw didn't resemble suns, though of course they were. It was the light shaft which changed their appearance. One day the saucer gave a lurch, and we were simultaneously below the speed of light and near our goal. Dead ahead was a multiple star system. Where it lay with relation to Earth, I don't know. Within 50 to 1,000 light-years, I suppose. For the first time in months, the robot stirred, went to the farmer, and began to work on him. I kept out of the way. It seemed the sensible thing to do. No matter how often I looked, I couldn't determine the location of the planet toward which we were bound. The ship knew, but I was in ignorance. From behind, in the next compartment, came the laboured sounds of the robot. Then there was another sound, and it didn't come from the robot. I looked in. The farmer sat up, gazed around, understood some or little of what he saw. That understanding was enough for him. He collapsed. He was still breathing, though, in spasmodic gasps. The revivification was a complete success. I decided to keep the man in mind. He was an important source of reserve strength. My hopes leapt high when I saw the planet. It was something less than the size of Saturn, but much larger than Earth. It was large enough to support a tremendous population. I hadn't bargained for anything so good. I had only a vague plan to go by. I had made the journey in complete safety, and that was most important. My next move would depend on circumstances. I could dematerialize myself off the ship and onto the planet. With an extreme expenditure of energy, I could even take the remainder of my food supply with me. But it didn't seem worth the effort. I had done all right so far by remaining quiet and letting events occur as they would. I decided to see it through on the same basis. I stayed in the ship and let it land. That was not my first mistake, landing with the ship. If anything, the error began 1,000 years earlier, in my infancy, the first night I saw the light of the moon. No one asked me to come. I did it voluntarily, for reasons my total personality found acceptable. In my own mind, I added up the advantages in leaving Earth, and then schemed until I found a way to do it. I had been dissatisfied with the way things were going among men. I objected to blood spilled uselessly, and so I had contrived an escape. Greener pastures? Not exactly. I don't like salads. Still, the saying conveys something of the way I felt. Long before the ship landed, it was too late, though I didn't know it. The robot scurried about the saucer, chirruping mechanically and creaking. When it finished the duties, it picked up the farmer and carried him out. The man was still unconscious, but he began to scream. Soon after it left, other robots came into the ship. Slightly different from the kind I had seen, they must have been repair robots. They went about tasks that were unfamiliar to me, and they talked. This was new. I couldn't understand what they said until I found the speech center of one and let my mind reach out lightly. "A master says there is a stowaway on one of the ships." It was unforeseen. Nothing I had encountered could detect my existence without registering on my consciousness. These masters were going to be tougher than humans. I waited while the other replied. "Do they know what ship he's on?" My robot waved a tentacle. "There are 10,000 ships here, each waiting for a checkover before reassignment. Would they bother to search each ship?" "Physically, you mean?" asked the other. "No. They will take him off as the ship leaves." Getting me off was going to take some doing, though the masters didn't know it. They may have gauged humans correctly, but they hadn't met me. Nevertheless, I was uneasy. "Why does he stay on the ship?" asked my robot. The other chuckled. "Maybe he's changed his mind and wants to go home. He'll be surprised when he learns where he's bound for." I'll admit I panicked then, because a robot chuckled. It's not the friendly sound you might think. And also because of what it said. I had no intention of going home, but I liked to think I could if I wanted to. Now I saw that, due to their system of rotating assignments, it was next to impossible to determine which ship was going back to Earth. I made up my mind quickly. Several things happened simultaneously. I dematerialized myself where I was, and rematerialized tenuously inside the robot. At the same time, I took control of its motor and brain centers. I forced it away from the job, and commanded it to go to the storage space where the last of my food was hidden. The other robot didn't notice. I surmised they didn't take orders from each other, but from someone above. For the moment, I was above. Out of the ship we went, and into the confusion of the repair shops. Nothing but ships and robots, and I had enough of these. I needed a hiding place to rest, and plan my forays against the creatures of this planet. I rummaged hurriedly through the robot brain, and learned that we were near the edge of a large city. Without cataloguing all the information I received, I forced the robot through obscure alleys toward the open plain that surrounded the city. It was cramped and uncomfortable inside the robot, even though I didn't exist as solid matter. And I had to operate blind. I couldn't adjust my sight to that of the robot, and had to function once removed from reality, through its incomplete senses. The last alley we entered ended on the open plain. The robot rolled down it, and stopped. I couldn't see what was in front of us, but I could guess. One of the creatures of the planet, the things that made the flying saucers. Without hesitation, I directed the robot to attack. It didn't. Its refusal was not unexpected. They would have been quite insane to build robots without installing some safeguards. It meant, however, that the next step was up to me. I took it. I dematerialized out of the robot and rematerialized facing my antagonist. On the average, it takes me a few microseconds to evaluate a foe and find his weakness. I looked longer than that. It was the first time I had seen anything that could destroy at a glance my confidence in my own survival capacity. And there was no weakness. What I did then was not cowardice. It was pure survival, the reaction of a nervous system shocked to the limits of endurance. I dematerialized myself from where I stood and rematerialized far out on the open plain. Twice I repeated the process until the city was out of sight over the horizon. The creature didn't follow, though it could have done so easily enough, if it had wanted to. I know my strength. On Earth, it's the source of legends, the shadowy, half-believed stories of werewolves and vampires. Fact and fancy mixed together to chill the minds and hearts of men. For myself, and others like me, it's a distinct advantage to have our existence doubted. A victim paralyzed with fear, too shocked and demoralized to cry out, is easier to subdue. But the strength I was so confident of is meaningless here. Crouched in the shadow of the boulder, the only shade on the arid plain, it suddenly dawned on me that the creatures who ruled this planet knew about me from the beginning, when I thought I was hidden. It amused them, I think. I can't go back to the city and find the farmer. He's their meat. And I have limitations. I can't dematerialize myself off this planet. A few drops of fluid are left in the container with the Red Cross stamp on it, my last link with Earth. I was born knowing the facts of my life. For 1,000 years I've taken my food where and how I could get it. But these creatures are different, not only in body chemistry. They have tougher than Teflon skin and have hydrofluoric acids in their veins. I've always killed for food, but they kill for pleasure. And their appearance exactly coincides with their character. I ought to know. But there's one escape they forgot about, and I will take it. When they come hunting, they won't find me. Self-destruction is preferable to meeting those horrors face to face again.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. Comment, like, and do all the things the algorithm needs.